Egypt. The year is 1155 BC. Pharaoh Ramesses III is dead, and someone has just broken into his tomb. Not a foreign army, not an enemy king. The thieves are the very workers who built it, and they knew exactly where everything was hidden. Egypt was the most powerful civilization on earth. Its armies had crushed entire empires, but it now faced a problem no sword could fix. It had secrets, and too many people knew them. What the thieves didn't know was that Egypt had already been watching. For centuries, it was about to show the world why no civilization before or since had ever built a more complete system for controlling, tracking, and recording its own people. A system so thorough it makes modern governments look careless. I'm BBH, before it became history. And today we're walking inside ancient Egypt at its absolute peak. Using AI reconstruction tools built on real historical records, papyrus documents, and archaeological findings, we're going to see this world up close, not from a textbook, but from the streets, the palaces, the temples, and the tiny village where the world's first labor strike happened. This is not the Egypt of mummies and curses. This is the Egypt of scribes and informants, of ration cards and attendance records, of oracles used as lie detectors and police forces designed to watch their own neighbors. 3 million people, one river, one god-king who claimed to be divine, and a record-keeping machine so powerful it tracked what you ate, why you missed work, and what you dreamed at night. This is how you build the world's first surveillance state. And this is what it actually looked like to live inside it. Stand here, right in the middle of Ramesses, the capital city that Ramesses II built from scratch in the eastern Nile Delta. This place was not just a city, it was a machine. And every single part of it was designed to do one thing: keep the pharaoh in total control of everything and everyone inside his empire. The city was massive. Over 300,000 people lived here at its peak. It had temples, barracks, and stables big enough to hold hundreds of horses. But the real heart of Ramesses was not the grand statues or the golden gates. It was a building most visitors would walk straight past: the scribal offices. Long, low rooms filled with men bent over papyrus, writing from sunrise to sunset. These were the people who actually ran Egypt. Every single thing that moved through this empire had a record. Grain going into a storehouse, recorded. A worker missing a day at the tomb site, recorded. A fishing boat crossing a checkpoint on the Nile, recorded. A complaint from a farmer about his neighbor stealing wheat, recorded, filed, and sent up the chain. Egypt didn't just build monuments in stone. It built the world's first paper trail. And that trail stretched from the Mediterranean coast all the way to the southern tip of Nubia. At the top of this system sat the vizier. Think of him as Egypt's prime minister, chief judge, and head of the civil service all rolled into one. Every morning, reports arrived at his office from across the empire. Flood levels, tax collections, worker attendance, border activity, crime reports. He read all of it. He answered to one person only, the pharaoh. And the pharaoh answered to no one because the pharaoh was a god. This is what made Egypt different from every other ancient civilization. Most empires ran on loyalty and fear. Egypt ran on paperwork. The scribes were trained for years. They learned over 700 hieroglyphic signs. They kept records in duplicate. They cross-checked numbers. If your ration count didn't match last month's record, someone would notice. If a shipment of copper arrived short by even a small amount, the discrepancy was flagged, investigated, and resolved. Nothing slipped through without someone writing it down. And here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. Because of all this record-keeping, we know more today about the daily life of an ordinary Egyptian worker in 1200 BC than we know about most people who lived in medieval Europe just 600 years ago. We know what workers ate for lunch. We know when they were sick and what excuse they gave. We know who argued with who and who got caught stealing. The pyramids get all the attention. But the real wonder of ancient Egypt was this: a bureaucratic system so careful, so thorough, and so relentless that it preserved the lives of ordinary people across 3,000 years of history. That is power. Not just building big. Building in a way that lasts forever. Walk past the scribal offices, past the military barracks, past the wide processional roads lined with stone statues, and you reach the part of Ramesses that ordinary Egyptians could see but never enter. The palace complex. A world so separate from the rest of the city that it almost felt like a different country sitting inside the same walls. The outer halls came first. These were designed to make every visitor feel small. Towering painted columns. Floors polished smooth enough to reflect the light. Walls covered in scenes of the pharaoh crushing enemies, hunting lions, receiving gifts from foreign kings. Every surface was a message. You are standing in the house of a god. Act accordingly. Foreign ambassadors were received here. Enemy kings who had surrendered came here to kneel. Trade delegations from as far away as the Aegean coast and sub-Saharan Africa walked through these halls carrying gold, ivory, and exotic animals as tribute. The public palace was theater. Every detail was calculated to make the pharaoh look less like a man and more like a force of nature that happened to wear a crown. But behind those public halls was a completely different world. The inner palace was where Ramesses actually lived. And the contrast was striking. Private gardens with pools stocked with fish. Tiled bathrooms with drainage systems built into the floor. Separate kitchens preparing meals from ingredients sourced across the entire empire. Wine from the Delta, beef from the Delta farms, imported oils and spices arriving by ship from the Eastern Mediterranean. The pharaoh did not eat what his people ate. He ate what his empire could produce at its absolute finest. Then there was the harem. And this is where the story gets darker. The royal harem was not simply a collection of wives. It was a full institution. It had its own administrator, its own treasury, its own workshops where women produced fine linen cloth, its own school for the children of the royal family. Hundreds of women lived inside it, wives, secondary wives, the daughters of foreign kings sent as diplomatic gifts, servants, and attendants. It had its own economy running quietly inside the palace walls. It also had its own politics, and its own rage. The most famous assassination attempt in Egyptian history was born inside these walls. The harem conspiracy, as historians now call it, was a plot to kill Ramesses III organized by one of his secondary wives who wanted her own son placed on the throne. She recruited palace officials, military officers, and even people from outside the palace who were smuggled letters written in secret. The plan nearly worked. The state that had built the most sophisticated surveillance system in the ancient world, the state that tracked grain shipments and workers' sick days and border crossings, had failed to watch the people sleeping under its own roof. The most dangerous threats were never outside the walls. They were always within them. Egypt had no Colosseum, no chariot racing stadiums packed with screaming crowds, no gladiators fighting to the death for ticket-buying fans. What Egypt had was something more calculated, more deliberate, and in many ways far more powerful than any arena ever built. It had festivals, and it used them like weapons. The Opet festival was the biggest event in the Egyptian calendar. Every year, for anywhere between 11 and 27 days, the entire city stopped working. The streets filled with music, food, and dancing. Massive statues of the god Ammonius were lifted out of Karnak Temple and carried in a great procession along the Nile to Luxor Temple, surrounded by priests, soldiers, acrobats, and singers. Ordinary Egyptians who spent their entire lives working in fields and workshops lined the streets and watched their god move through their city. Free food was distributed. Beer flowed. The atmosphere was electric. But here is what the crowds didn't fully understand. The Opet festival was not a gift. It was a tool. The entire event was engineered to do one thing: to tie the emotional loyalty of 3 million people to the pharaoh and the gods at the exact same moment. When you watch your god walk through your streets and your king walks beside him, the line between religion and political power disappears completely. That was exactly the point. And then there was the other kind of spectacle. The kind that was not designed to make you feel joy. Egypt's punishment system was brutally public. Executions did not happen in private rooms behind closed doors. They happened where people could see them. Beatings were carried out in open courtyards. But the most disturbing practice was what happened after major military victories. Defeated enemies, soldiers captured in battle, had their right hands cut off. Sometimes their noses too. The severed hands were piled in public view outside the temple walls, and then the scribes got to work. They counted the piles. Every hand was recorded. The final numbers were carved permanently into temple walls in enormous hieroglyphic inscriptions for all to see. Ramesses III's victory records at Medinet Habu show over 12,000 hands counted after a single campaign against the Sea Peoples. Think about what that means. Egypt was not just defeating its enemies. It was making its own population watch the math of what defeat looked like. Those carvings were not military records stored in an archive somewhere. They were displayed on the most visible public buildings in the country, at eye level, where every farmer and craftsman and child walking past could see them every single day. This is what happens when you challenge the God King. The count is right there on the wall. Permanent. Undeniable. Carved in stone so it would last longer than any person alive to witness it. Egypt understood something that took the rest of the world centuries to figure out. The most effective form of control is not just punishing people. It is making sure everyone else watches. Walk toward the Nile. Follow the sound of chanting. You will find yourself standing at the entrance of Karnak, the largest religious complex ever built in the ancient world. A site so vast that the entire Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris could fit inside its main hall with room to spare. Karnak was not one temple. It was a city of temples, built and expanded by pharaoh after pharaoh over more than 1,000 years. And it was not just a place of worship. It was one of the most powerful economic and political institutions Egypt had ever produced. The temples of Karnak and Luxor together employed tens of thousands of people. Priests, scribes, bakers, brewers, farmers, builders, administrators. By the time of Ramesses III, the temple institution owned over 100,000 workers, more than 400,000 head of cattle, and roughly 1/3 of all farmable land in Egypt. The temples were not just spiritual centers. They were corporations, and their product was divine authority, packaged, distributed, and sold to the population in the form of ritual, festival, and fear. But the single most powerful tool inside this entire religious system was something small enough to carry on your shoulders. The oracle. During festivals, statues of the gods were mounted on sacred wooden barges and carried through the streets on the shoulders of priests. Crowds lined the processional routes, and ordinary Egyptians, farmers, craftsmen, widows, merchants, were allowed to step forward and submit questions. Written on small flakes of stone or pottery, their questions covered everything. Is my neighbor stealing from my field? Did my brother cheat me out of our father's inheritance? Who robbed my house while I was away? The priests would carry the statue forward. If it moved or dipped toward a particular answer, that was the god's verdict. The case was closed. This was Egypt's court system. And it worked because the population believed it completely. But here is the part that makes the skin prickle. The priests carrying those statues were not neutral. They were temple employees. They served the institution. In many cases they already knew the answers to the questions being asked, because the temples had their own networks of informants, their own records, their own intelligence about what was happening in local communities. When the tomb robbery investigations of 1155 BC required confessions and identifications, the oracle was used to point at the guilty. Whether the god truly chose those men, or whether the priests already knew who they were and simply guided the statue accordingly, that question had no meaning in ancient Egypt. The god and the state spoke with the same voice, through the same mouth, using the same hands. That was the genius of it. Egypt never needed to separate religion from government because it never allowed the two to become separate in the first place. Faith was surveillance. Worship was compliance. And the temple was the most elegant control system the ancient world ever built. Every system of control needs enforcers. People who walk the streets, watch the borders, guard the tombs, and make sure the rules carved into temple walls actually mean something on the ground. Egypt had those people. And they were unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. They were called the Medjay. Originally they came from Nubia, the vast desert region south of Egypt's border. They were recruited as warriors, brought into Egyptian service, and gradually transformed into something far more significant than a border patrol unit. Over centuries, the Medjay became Egypt's internal security force, the world's first organized police. And they operated in ways that feel surprisingly modern. They worked in pairs. They carried wooden batons as their standard weapon, Not swords, not spears, but batons, the same way beat officers carry them today. They filed written reports after incidents. They were stationed at fixed patrol points across villages, tomb sites, and state facilities. When a crime was reported, the Medjay investigated it, gathered testimony, and submitted findings to the local administrator who passed them up the chain. The system had procedures. It had paperwork. It had accountability, at least on paper. But the most deliberate and revealing decision Egypt made about its police force was this. The Medjay were always outsiders. This was not an accident. The state made a calculated choice to staff its security apparatus with people who had no family connections, no childhood friendships, and no tribal loyalties to the communities they were sent to police. A Medjay officer stationed in a Delta village had no cousin there to protect, no old neighbor to ignore, no local priest to show loyalty to. He answered to the state alone. His career, his rations, and his entire livelihood depended on the institution, not the community. Egypt understood something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. People protect what they belong to. So if you want enforcement without favoritism, you bring in people who belong to nothing local. The Medjay were stationed everywhere the state had something to lose. Villages near royal building sites, checkpoints along major Nile trade routes, and most importantly, the Valley of the Kings, the vast royal cemetery outside Thebes where the pharaohs and their treasures were buried in deep rock-cut tombs. The Medjay guarded those tombs around the clock. And this is where the story twists in a way that should stop you cold. Egypt's greatest tomb robberies, the systematic looting of the Valley of the Kings that began around 1100 BC, were not carried out by cunning strangers who slipped past the guards in the night. They were carried out by people who knew every tunnel, every sealed doorway, every hidden chamber, and every weak point in every tomb. People exactly like the guards themselves. The surveillance state had built the most disciplined security force in the ancient world. And that security force became its most devastating vulnerability. The people you trust to protect the system are the same people who know best how to break it. It looks like the outline you pasted is a repeat of the military/security section we already covered in Section 5. Based on the script structure, Section 6 should be the infrastructure and engineering section, the nilometer, grain stores, and ration system. I've written that below. Forget the pyramids for a moment. Forget the temples and the statues and the painted columns. If you want to understand how Egypt actually held 3 million people together for 3,000 years, you need to look at something far less glamorous. You need to look at grain. Grain was Egypt's real power. Not gold. Not military might. Not divine authority. The state that controlled the food supply controlled everything and everyone attached to it. And Egypt controlled its food supply with a level of precision that no other civilization in the ancient world came close to matching. It started at the river. At multiple points along the Nile, Egypt built structures called nilometers, carefully carved stone columns or staircases set directly into the riverbed, marked with precise measurement lines. Every year when the Nile began its annual flood, officials would watch the nilometer closely and record exactly how high the water rose. That single measurement told them almost everything they needed to plan the coming year. A high flood meant rich soil deposits and a strong harvest. A low flood meant thin soil and possible shortage. A flood that was too high meant destroyed crops and potential famine. From that one reading, taken months before the crops were even planted, Egypt's administrators could calculate expected yields, set tax rates, adjust ration allocations, and move grain reserves between regions that needed them. They were essentially predicting the future with a stick in the water. And they were accurate enough to run an empire on it. The grain that came from those harvests did not belong to the farmers who grew it. It belonged to the state. It flowed into massive government-controlled silos, enormous mud brick storage facilities built at temple complexes and administrative centers across the country. From those silos, it was distributed back outward through a ration system so detailed and so carefully maintained that it functioned as something Egypt never officially invented but absolutely practiced. An identity system. Every worker attached to a state project received rations. Not wages paid in coins. Egypt had no coins. Payment came in measured amounts of grain, bread, beer, oil, and cloth, distributed regularly and recorded by name, by occupation, and by daily output. Your ration allocation was your place in the system made physical. It told officials who you were, what you did, where you belonged, and whether you had shown up to do it. Miss work without a recorded excuse, and the ration record reflected it. Produce more than your quota, and the record reflected that too. The system rewarded compliance and flagged absence automatically, without anyone needing to follow you home. The Nilometer still stands today. Sections of ancient grain silos have been excavated and studied. And the accounting logic Egypt used, measure the resource, predict the yield, distribute proportionally, record every transaction, still underpins the way modern governments manage public resources. Egypt did not just feed its people. It fed them in a way that made every meal a reminder of who was in charge. Step outside the temples. Walk away from the palace complex and the scribal offices and the grain silos. Follow the narrow path that winds through the desert cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, past the Valley of the Kings, until you reach a small walled village tucked into a dry valley where almost no natural life grows. No trees, no river access, no farms, just rock, dust, and rows of small mud brick houses built so close together that neighbors could hear each other breathe through the walls. This is Deir el-Medina, and it is the most completely documented ordinary community in the entire ancient world. About 60 families lived here at any given time. The men were skilled artisans, painters, sculptors, stonemasons, whose single job was to cut, decorate, and finish the royal tombs in the valley nearby. The state had chosen them carefully, trained them, and placed them in this village specifically because their work was too sensitive to allow them to live among the general population. They knew too much. They knew where the tombs were. They knew what was inside them. So the state put them somewhere it could watch them constantly. And then it wrote everything down. The records that survive from Deir el-Medina are unlike anything else from the ancient world. Attendance registers listing which workers showed up each day and which ones did not. Next to the absences, the reasons. Worker Panab missed work because he was sick. Worker Kai missed 3 days because he was embalming his mother. Worker Amenhotep missed work because, and this is written exactly as it sounds, he was brewing beer. These are not summaries or estimates. These are daily records maintained by a village scribe whose entire job was to document the workforce every single morning without exception. The village had its own court. Disputes between neighbors were heard, argued, and decided locally, with the verdicts written down and filed. A woman accused her neighbor of stealing a tool. A man claimed another had damaged his roof during construction. Workers accused each other of taking more than their ration share. Every case, every verdict, written down. And then there are the other documents. The ones the state did not ask anyone to write. Love poems scratched onto broken pottery. Personal letters complaining about unfair treatment. Notes between friends. Gossip. Anger. A worker writing to a colleague that a particular supervisor was corrupt and everyone knew it. These fragments survived because the desert preserved them, not because anyone intended them to last. In 1170 BC, the ration deliveries stopped arriving. The workers waited. Then they waited longer. Then they put down their tools, walked out of the valley, and sat down in protest outside a nearby temple. The first recorded labor strike in human history. Their demand was simple. Pay us what you owe us. Feed us what you promised. The surveillance state had recorded 3,000 years of compliance. What it could not prevent and could not erase was the moment ordinary people decided that enough was enough. Egypt did not fall in a single day. There was no one battle, no one conqueror, no one moment where everything collapsed at once. That is not how systems this large and this deeply rooted actually die. They erode. Slowly. From the inside. The way a stone wall weakens not from a single hard blow but from years of small cracks that nobody bothered to fill. The signs were there long before the end. The scribal class that had held the entire administrative machine together began to weaken as state resources dried up. Ration payments to workers arrived late, then later, then sometimes not at all. The labor strike at Deir el-Medina in 1170 BC was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a state that was beginning to lose its grip on the basic promises it had made to its own people. When you build a system on the guarantee that compliance will be rewarded, The moment you stop delivering the reward, compliance stops meaning anything. The priests grew more powerful as the pharaohs grew weaker. By 1069 BC, the high priest of Ammonius at Karnak had accumulated enough land, enough wealth, and enough military loyalty to effectively rule southern Egypt as a separate power. The country split. Not with a war. With a quiet administrative separation that the records capture in plain, almost emotionless language. Egypt simply became two things where it had once been one. And then the tomb robbers came. Not strangers. Not foreign raiders. The people who broke into the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings during this period were locals. Administrators. Former guards. People who had spent their careers inside the system, who knew the records, who knew the patrol schedules, who knew which officials could be bribed and which seals could be replaced without anyone noticing. The Great Harris Papyrus, one of the longest surviving documents from ancient Egypt, records the investigations into these robberies in careful detail. Officials were caught. Confessions were made. Some were punished. But the looting continued anyway, because the system that was supposed to stop it had already lost the thing that made it work. Belief. When the people running a surveillance state stop believing in it themselves, no amount of paperwork can hold it together. What was lost is almost impossible to fully measure. 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge about agriculture, medicine, engineering, astronomy, and administration. Entire libraries of papyrus records that did not survive the decay of the institutions that stored them. A model of centralized state organization so advanced that the civilizations that came after Egypt spent centuries trying to rebuild pieces of what Egypt had already perfected. What could have been is the harder question. A civilization that had already invented the police force, the welfare system, the census, the court record, and the labor contract. If it had held together, if the cracks had been filled, if the rations had kept arriving, how much further could it have gone? We will never know. The records stopped. And the desert kept the silence. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The civilization we have been walking through today ended over 3,000 years ago. Its language died. Its gods were forgotten. Its capital cities were buried under sand and farmland. And yet almost everything Egypt built, not in stone but in systems, is still running right now, today, in every country on earth. Think about the last time you showed up to work and someone marked you present. That is a Deir el Medina attendance record. Think about the last time a government used population data to calculate how much food, money, or resources a region needed. That is a Nilometer reading. Think about the last time you were asked to show identification before receiving a service the state provides. That is an Egyptian ration card. The specific tools are different. The logic underneath them is identical. Egypt invented the idea that a functioning state requires information. Not just laws. Not just armies. Information. Detailed, updated, cross-checked records of who its people are, what they do, what they own, and whether they are following the rules. Every database a modern government maintains, every census form you have ever filled out, every attendance system, tax record, court filing, and police report, all of it descends from the papyrus and reed pen bureaucracy that Egyptian scribes perfected before most of the world had figured out how to write it all. And Egypt also left us the question that no civilization since has managed to fully answer. The workers of Deir el Medina asked it first in 1170 BC when they sat down outside the temple and refused to move. The harem conspirators asked it in a darker way from inside the palace walls. The tomb robbers asked it with their hands in the burial chambers of the valley. When a state builds a system powerful enough to watch everyone, who watches the state? When the people running the records are the same people making the decisions, who checks whether the decisions are honest? Egypt never solved that problem. Neither has anyone else. Every argument happening right now about government surveillance, about data privacy, about how much information a state should be allowed to collect about its own citizens, that argument is not new. It is ancient. It started on the banks of the Nile, in a walled village full of skilled workers who were fed, housed, protected, and watched every single day of their lives. They were grateful for the food. They resented the watching. They needed the system. They also knew the system could be turned against them at any moment. That tension has never gone away. It just moved. Egypt built the blueprint. We are all still living inside it. The question is whether we are scribes faithfully recording the truth, or whether we are guards who have learned the location of every hidden chamber. If this made you think, drop a comment below, and tell me which civilization should we walk through next. If the story changed how you see the world around you, then you're already starting to notice what most people miss. Because everything you see today had a beginning. And this is exactly what we uncover here on Before It Became History, the moments before everything changed. So if you want more stories like this, where we break down how the past quietly shaped your life today, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to Before It Became History. Because the next story might explain something you've always wondered, but never questioned.